Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Scott Lavin from Tyee Resources. John and Scott will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our host of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Scott.
Welcome to Connecting with Conservation. I'm John Gassett with Wildlife Management Institute. I'm here with my co-host Scott Lavin, who does business development in the outdoor conservation industry. And we have a special guest with us today, Lou Cornicelli, Dr. Lou Cornicelli, who works for Southwick Associates, which is our one and only and premier conservation economist. And Lou has a long history of working with state fish and wildlife agencies over his career. So, Lou, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I've like every other short Italian kids from Long Island, I went into wildlife management. So I did my undergraduate and master's degree in wildlife ecology. Ended up doing a PhD in the social sciences because we did a lot of decision making and looking at regulations and how to deal with the public. But worked a lot with you in when I was in Utah and you were in Kentucky, and jumped over to Rob's shop about 3 years ago, and now I do a bunch of different things related to working with state agencies, NGOs, different conservation partners on an array of projects really related to R3, helping with agency decision making and looking at different regulatory alternatives with different things. And as you said, Rob is the person who does natural resources economics in this space. So it's been great jumping over and doing something a little different towards the back end of the career.
Cool. So I know you're trained, and had a career in the hard sciences, but would you classify your work with Rob more of a social scientist, I guess? 'Cause a lot of the work y'all do are public attitudes and opinions and what people think about things.
We do a lot of market research in the hunting, fishing, and shooting sports, right? That's what Rob's really known for, and he's one of the pioneers in evaluating R3, recruitment, retention, reactivation. So we do a lot of that. Work with, like I said, the states and other NGOs and private industry and market research and just about everything. But yeah, we do a lot in that social science space, economic space. We're not doing biological projects, but we certainly do a lot of everything else.
I think a lot of people don't realize, as you're a third-party entity, you guys add a lot of resource. I'm more on the program design, and I don't have the resource, the money, or the time to do research. I can talk to you guys, and I met Rob my first year on the job out here 12 years ago. You guys give the data that inform my decisions on how I spend my money and how I build my teams, and so it's highly valuable.
Yeah, appreciate that. And he has several people who have worked for agencies, not just me, and I think we bring that perspective from inside the house, right? We kind of know how the politics work in an agency and what information does an agency need really to be successful because we work there. And Rob has a great sense for how to write a proposal and kind of really key on the things that, what are your questions? And then we can help answer those in a really objective and scientific way. And that's what I appreciate. It's not willy-nilly stuff, right? It's working really closely with our partners to help them be more successful and give them answers that they need. Not always what they want, right? Because but certainly what we feel is that this is what we're seeing. So yeah, it's good.
We were talking earlier. There's not a lot of science researchers. You're a little more on the economic side. There's some a little more on the public side, but there are some that do focus groups and so on. But there's not that many in this industry, right? But what's cool is the ones that are in this industry are very stable. They've been around. I've been able to go to all of them for years. I'm friends. I've been fishing with Rob. We're friends. We've been hunting together. That helps the process, right? Because now you and I know each other. You kind of know where I always try to, target my programs. And you guys have informed me on what kind of research I should even consider doing.
Right. And the other beauty of this, this is a small community, right? Whether it's a manufacturer or a state agency or a small company like ours, it's a small world, right? Everybody knows everybody. And you can really leverage our expertise with, say, the DJ Cases of the world, who do a lot of qualitative work, and they're excellent at it. And they also do some quantitative stuff, too. So we can really partner with, as a more broad team to help answer questions. So it's good. Nobody works in a silo, right? You're never going to be successful in a silo. And and you see that a lot even within agencies, where there's a habitat section and a management section, and a policy section, and they don't talk to each other. And I think you're less successful overall. And John was a director. He would agree with me, I think, that you're only successful when you work together.
Well, and that also surprised me, because coming from the commercial industry, I didn't have lunch with my competitors, but and you guys really aren't competitors. You guys, I've seen many grant projects where you guys are co-collaborators, but to see your organization sitting with DJKs, having lunch, talking about stuff in the committees together and so forth, and the other brands that are out there, you guys have a great working relationship, and we all coexist. And it's kind of that rising tide, raising all boats.
Yeah, I agree, and I think as in your podcast, as you talk about the Pittman-Robertson and the money going from R3 for multi-state conservation grants, there's all this money and there's all these needs. Agencies don't have the staffing to do everything they want to do. And these grants are providing opportunities to help states answer questions, to help them be more successful in that R3 space. And I think that's where we get really good at these kinds of things, is when we can work together, figure out what some of the questions are and answer them, and then give the states that data, and then they can either say, okay, this works for me, this doesn't work, but this does, and then they implement what they think is best based on some pretty objective science.
Yeah, when we were in that committee meeting yesterday, and we were talking about some projects, and having people like you in the room to say, you know what, somebody's already researched that. This is here. Because there's so much out there, right? We don't have time to go through thousands and thousands of reports, and having people who do the work, who know what work is getting done, saves a lot of time.
Yeah, and my last about 10 years of my career, I supervised our wildlife research unit, right, which is pretty heavy on peer-reviewed publications and real hard science. But we have to recognize that the vast majority of stuff that gets done in the conservation world doesn't get published. It stays out in the gray literature, or used to be a filing cabinet, now is a hard drive. And it's you still need folks that can say, hey, this has been done before. There's no reason you should know that, because it's sitting in someone's computer, but it's been done. And I think you live outside that peer-reviewed world and more in the gray literature and agency report world, which is 9% of what's done.
Right. Well, and one of the focuses of this podcast, the Connecting with Conservation podcast, is telling the conservation story in layman's terms, how it really works. And I think a big part of that conservation story is the excise tax on products. And I know you've done work for me when I was in Kentucky. You do work for Scott in his state and many other states, but you actually are doing work for WMI and have for the last several years on products being brought into the country and avoiding the tax. So, what we're finding is it looks like there's millions of dollars getting lost because of the way the tax system is set up, and they can ship it direct to your doorstep, and it avoids that. So it puts American companies at a disadvantage of 10 to 11%. And in many cases, it's putting inferior products on the market, and it's really gaming the system. It's costing conservation. So tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing. So.
Yeah, work we're doing with WMI and what we call excise tax slippage. So we're looking at folks that buy a product online, looking at price and, like you said, not necessarily quality, and they're avoiding paying the avoidance of excise tax being paid, right? Because the consumer doesn't pay the excise tax; it's paid on the producer side. So folks are buying these products that have avoided that excise tax, which then limits that 10 or 11%, whether it's archery or fishing, right? That goes into the Pittman-Robertson Dingell-Johnson pot that eventually gets allocated back out to the states for conservation management.
I just want to, if I can for a minute, I want to bring this down to the everyday hunter. They're not doing that intentionally to subvert the system, but they don't know. They're we all shop online, right? So they see a product that looks like it's going to do the job for them. It's the right price that fits in their lifestyle and their budget, and they're doing it. So they're uninformed, and it's a big story to tell, and that's part of our challenge, is educating the consumer, and we're not trying to, draw a line on which company to shop from and all, but having that awareness that, well, I'm purchasing this product, it funds conservation. I'm purchasing this product, I didn't know it didn't fund
right.
conservation.
Exactly, right. And when we survey folks across the country, most hunters and anglers know that they pay the bulk of conservation right through license sales, and they also know that some ammunition fishing equipment. But when they're on Amazon looking for a set of jigs, they're not thinking, well, is this company paying the excise? It's just not on your radar.
Right.
Nor really should it be.
They probably assume that it is.
Assume that
Right,
it is
right.
because it's for sale and everything else is, right?
And so, not to get too technical, but the issue is the tax is assessed at the first point of importation into the country. So if you're a huge distributor, of course you're in the business and you have to pay that tax because you're dealing with a huge volume of product in one location. But when it's the end user buying a set of a dozen arrows for $60 from China or Southeast Asia, the IRS can't come to that individual purchaser's house and assess the $1.50 of tax that they should have paid. So it's not in many cases it's not an intentional situation, but I think there are some subdivisions of that. One is they're just putting products out there hoping people will buy them because of price points or whatever. But then if you read the descriptions on some of them or the names even, where this looks almost very similar to an American company, but one letter's changed. There's a deceptive aspect for some of this too, where they're trying to mimic and draw buyers away from a well-known brand in the U.S. by trying to imply that theirs is the same thing.
Right, and if you buy a pen reel anywhere, it's going to be taxed. If you buy a pin reel, off Amazon, it's probably not taxed. So and it's nuanced, right? And I think that's why it's really not on the consumer to figure this stuff out. It's on the rest of us to figure out where those deficiencies lie, i.e. the amount of tax that's not paid, and then do something about that at that higher level.
Well, I think the world's moving so fast. Every industry is struggling to keep up, and this is a change in the shopping environment and the ability to obtain product. All of us could order something on our phone right now. It would beat us home, right? Yeah. And that's great for the velocity of lifestyle, but then the regulatory issues, the fair chase, everything that follows behind that has to sprint to try and keep up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and agencies, historically, agencies have always chased technology. That's just the nature of the beast. We start hunting with long bows and recurve bows, and then somebody creates a compound bow, and then they create a higher let-off compound bow, and then they got a crossbow that is even faster and better. And so it's like we're always trying to chase technology regulatory, from a regulatory standpoint, because you can't write a regulation until you know what you're dealing with, and you got to see what that thing is first. So
yeah, and like we dealt with that all the time in Minnesota. One quick example is somebody I forget who it was, but somebody came out with an electronic ignition muzzle loader, and it was legal in the state, and then people were complaining, why is that allowed? And the short answer was because when the muzzle loader law was written, this didn't exist. Right. So you're constantly chasing all this new technology, like smokeless powder and muzzle loaders. That can be legal because typically a definition is it must load from the front, and it doesn't say what kind of powder, and so that you get. And a lot of times it takes a long time to change laws, right, through the legislature because it's not important in many respects in the grander scheme of things. So you're just chasing that technology, chasing the laws to match the technology or not match it.
Yep, and in some places you can get ahead of it, but with products and technology, it's very difficult because, like you said, you don't know what the next. So I'll give you an example in Kentucky. When I started working there, we had a law that said, if we bought new public property, it was not open to public access until we created a regulation to open it, which is a 12-month process. We went and changed the law that said if we buy a piece of public property, it's open to these things until we say otherwise. So now rather than have a 12-month delay to 18-month delay on letting the public access property that was bought and paid for with their dollars, they can go immediately, and they may not be, the full gamut of all the opportunity there, but certainly they can, small game hunt and fish if there's fishing opportunities or whatever. So we try to get ahead of those things where we can, but with equipment, it's just really tough because, you never know, who's got the next thermal scope, and is that going to be a legal thing that's legal to hunt with or not for what species? So you just really never know what you're going to get.
Right, and then the whole law enforcement aspect of protecting our resources. I'm coyote hunting with a thermal image, but are you really doing that with look at your poach to pay project? Or you're saying you're doing one thing, but you're actually doing another, and the law provides for one activity but not the other. So it can get pretty challenging.
So connecting with conservation at its heart is about telling the conservation story and how that funding drives conservation in our country. So let's talk about a specific example that we all have a little bit of a part in. Kentucky, that's what got me to go from Georgia to Kentucky, is the opportunity to restore elk to the eastern U.S., to the eastern part of Kentucky, and that's where I met you. You were a Utah guy, a regional biologist for Utah, and had mostly private land with a lot of elk damage and needed to move some elk. So
yeah, it was. We were much younger, right, back in the day.
A lot less gray.
So a lot less gray. So in brief story, I was the deer research biologist in Indiana. Had an opportunity to go west to Utah to be a regional wildlife manager in the northern part of the state. And I'd been there, I don't know, maybe a year, and I was talking to Jim Mitchell, who was the deer management biologist who since passed away. And I was complaining about elk problems, which are new to me, right, as a Midwestern, Eastern kid. And we couldn't really manage elk because we had mostly private land on our winter range. Our elk were above objectives, and we were having all sorts of trouble and had been long-term chronic problems. So Jim and I are talking, and he said, "Did you hear that Kentucky's looking for elk? They just finished a project." And I said, "No." So I called John Phillips, who was the big game coordinator at the time, your predecessor, and I just cold called him. And so we were chatting, and he told me about the project, and they were, looking to put him in the eastern part of the state, in reclaimed mine country. And I asked him, "Well, where are you getting the elk?" And he said, "Well, we haven't quite figured that out yet." And I said, "Well, I think we can work with you." I said, "Are you going to the Western Deer and Elk Workshop in Nogales, Arizona?" And he said, "I am." And I said, "Let's meet." So we met, and we started talking about the project. And I wasn't thinking about the North American model at the time. I was thinking, well, this is a pretty neat project. I'm from the East Coast. Elk were extirpated a long time ago. We have a real elk problem, conflict problem. We know wildlife conflict is a big issue. And we can kind of resolve it, well, not resolve it, but at least alleviate it a little bit by helping restore native species or to its native range. And from 1997 to 2002, Utah gave Kentucky almost 1,100 elk, and got the start. And you can pick up where I'm leaving off. But we met in 2000, I think, at the Wildlife Society meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, and a friendship blossomed from there for the last 25 years. And then it was a great project.
Well, and that project was, it really is what got me into stateside conservation, because I can recall going through school telling my major professor, "I'll never work for a state agency. I want to be a university professor. I want to teach young kids about conservation, and I want them to be the biologist." And I couldn't pass up the opportunity to restore a large charismatic mammal in the East, which is just unheard of. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and then you add the piece with that real close relationship we have with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and they were integral. They wouldn't tell a state what to do, but when the state made the decision to do it, they were all in. And I think as the years have gone by, then Kentucky gave elk to Missouri and Wisconsin and Virginia, and those were all seeded from Utah, some from Arizona, right? And a handful from Kansas. Chris Timison was here. So these, we all work together to help another agency. We really haven't met the people working for them, but it's a conservation mission with a NGO partner that's really invested, and it worked out at the end of the day.
So before we get too far down the river on this, as the only non-PhD at the table here, I want to go back to something you pointed out, because I think the general public, I never thought this could be a thing before I was in this industry. You said you had too much elk and it was causing damage. And I don't think the average citizen can imagine that too much of any species could be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, John and I can both touch on this, but the reality is that the land can, there's a social and biological tolerance that the land can support, right? And mostly it's social. You don't often, with few exceptions, you don't see wildlife at such a level that the landscape is really impacted negatively. It happens, don't get me wrong, but generally it's social tolerance. So elk are causing crop damage. They're causing stored forage haystack damage. They're limiting, winter range for other livestock or other wildlife. So the states typically, and Utah is a good example, we're going to manage a unit for, say, 3,000 elk, wintering elk. But you do an aerial survey and you count 6,000. And when it's private land, you really reach a saturation point where you can only give out so many licenses for cow elk in the late season. You can give out 1,000, you kill 100 elk. You give out 2,000, you kill 103 elk, because there's a limited number of people who can access the land. But you're under an objective of managing for a certain number, and so you start looking at other ways to do it. And rather than the agency removing problem elk, which we would do on occasion for depredation, giving them to a state that sees them as a more valued, not valued, but certainly more important resource as they start a new population, then that's a surplus for us, and we can work with that.
And I think it's a great story. And those stories aren't told to the general public. You preserved a large volume of, as you said, charismatic species, reintroduced them to a historic range. Is there a better story of efficiently, preserving wildlife, right?
Yeah, and it's not so simple as you want 100, they'll be here on Tuesday, right? We have to.
They didn't have Amazon then?
We did not. You have to secure permission on private land to trap. Do you use a corral trap where they walk in and basically catch themselves, or are you going to use a helicopter to catch them one by one? But if you use a helicopter, then you have to contract with a company that's qualified to do that work. Then you have to hold the animals. You need a facility because they have to be disease tested. It has to be worthwhile for the agency to come get them with a tractor trailer. You can't send 4 at a time. So there's a whole bunch of, it's not Patton's Army, but there's a lot of logistic stuff that goes into a large wildlife transplant project. And that's partly why you don't see them. They're expensive, they're time consuming, they take away from other priorities for the agency.
Well, and now there's the disease risk.
And now there's the disease risk.
Moving
right.
In. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And I'm going to try to do this justice, but it's from memory, and bear in mind it's 20-year-old memories. So our target was to put 1,800 elk on the ground in 9 years. We started in 97. And I came on board in 99. We escalated the number of elk moving from 200 a year to 500 or 600 because we knew we were racing the clock with chronic wasting disease. And we ended the project in 2002, the restoration part of the project in 2002, having moved 1,551 animals. So we were just shy of our goal, but we did get pretty close to it pretty quickly, and we shut it down when we felt like the CWD risk was just too great. So Kentucky was involved. Utah obviously was involved. Arizona provided us with elk. Oregon provided us with elk from the Starkey Center. North Dakota from the Teddy Roosevelt. Kansas from Fort Riley. And New Mexico from provided us elk as well. Now, interesting story. And all of those states, without checking, I would almost guarantee you that the work that went on in those states to secure those animals and get them moving, those staff were PR-funded staff. So they were paid by excise tax dollars that industry had paid into conservation. And the more interesting twist is that when we gave elk to Missouri in a trade, they gave us, Bob Zemer, who was the director there at the end for Missouri Department of Conservation, gave us 400,000 crappie that were raised with DJ dollars. And when we took elk from New Mexico, we gave them 1 million striper fry that were raised with DJ dollars. So we have DJ, Pittman Robertson, we had the Elk Foundation, which you mentioned earlier, that gave over $2 million to this effort and helped build the corral traps and fund the cost of trapping and transportation. So, the value that the public got is a herd of elk in the east that's over 13,000 according to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's the largest in the east. I suspect at some point it'll soon be connected with the Virginia herd and the West Virginia herd, possibly Pennsylvania, and certainly Tennessee and North Carolina. So we'll have a herd of elk that's, basically the length of the Appalachians because of excise tax dollars, license dollars, and conservation partners like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Yeah, and I'll add one piece before you came on board. The first year of the project, Kentucky gave South Dakota eastern wild turkeys, and South Dakota gave Utah Rio Grande wild turkeys. And those turkeys from South Dakota actually went to the region that the elk came from. So now there's Rios in northern Utah. That weren't there before, so it's a there's
a turkey elk love triangle.
It was for a little while. It became a little. We didn't get that many, and we only did it that 1 year because it was too much on the logistics side.
Right. But certainly those conservation dollars that we like to talk about, whether it's the excise tax on products or the license dollars that sportsmen and women spend, when they say, well, what are you doing with my money? Well, here's a good case study. We now have a large mammal huntable large mammal population in the east that we wouldn't have had but for those dollars. So
yeah, and I think that kind of brings back to our North American model, right? This is a public resource. Even though the state has regulatory authority over what you do with that resource, it still belongs to the public. So the state can make that decision to share that public resource with another state. And they could certainly say no, but we were all raised, under the Teddy Roosevelt model and Gifford Pinchot. It's for the greater good. So even if you're not paying us for elk, or if you're just getting turkeys from a third party, you're still sharing that resource and passing it on to someone else. And I think that's the essence of what we do in the conservation space.
I think, and the story just can't be told enough, and this is what I'm so passionate about. Unless you're in upper management and as a manufacturer or retailer, you're not hearing these stories. You're not. And yes, those key decision makers absolutely need to know so they have buy-in. But, and we've gotten so much better. The Fish and Wildlife Service is doing so much better with the Partner with the Payer program, educating the employees. And they show a lot of pride. In Arizona, I wasn't involved in this elk project, but we do a lot of antelope relocations. And the first time you see a big game species being sling-loaded by a helicopter, that's a life-changing, that changes perspective. And I think the general public just thinks Mother Nature is on autopilot, and in most cases it is self-correcting. But we do have to manage wildlife because of the infringement of human populations.
Yep.
And elk weren't going to make their way back to East Kentucky.
No, they were not. Yeah. And
they had to have help.
You mentioned pronghorn, right? Because in Utah they catch pronghorn on the Parker Mountain every year, and they go everywhere. I think they had gone to Arizona, they've gone to Nevada, and Nevada was giving Utah desert bighorn sheep. So, and we had given Nevada elk while I was working there, and so these animals, and the Colorado's moose population is actually based from Utah in the 70s. Utah had given them a bunch of moose rather. But take a step back. Most of the elk in the West are resulting of survival herds out of Yellowstone. So a lot of the states, including Utah, got trainloads of elk from Yellowstone back in the teens, 1910, 1915. So it all goes back to somebody moved something from somewhere because we extirpated it from its original range.
Sure. And Scott, you mentioned a few minutes earlier, the Partner with the Payer program, and Tom Decker and his folks at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's a program that's sort of come up as we've worked on this industry and agency relationship over the years that, we really didn't know what the other side was doing. So state agencies didn't know what manufacturers were doing and what went into their business. Manufacturers didn't know where their excise tax dollars were going once they went to the states. So we started doing these business summits where we would feature a manufacturer or a state agency so that each side could see what the other one had to go through. And that eventually became Partner with the Payer, which is sort of one-stop shopping now. If you want to know how conservation is funded in this country, partnerwiththepayer.org certainly should go take a look at it. It's got a great amount of information on it. So we hope they keep driving that forward because, there's no substitute for putting those partners in the room regularly with each other so they're comfortable, they feel like they're colleagues, they feel like they're working towards a common objective, rather than I'm just the guy who writes the check that's the second largest check in my corporation every quarter outside of payroll for this tax thing, and I'm not sure where it goes. So
just real quick, you hit on it, meeting with them regularly. When this started 80 some years ago, the Remington family owned Remington, right? Malsburg family owned Malsburg. These are no longer family-owned businesses for the most part. I think Malsburg's still family-owned, but most of the industries from back then are either no longer in existence or they've been bought up by industry conglomerates. And a CEO changes almost yearly these days. So you have to constantly reintroduce that conversation.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that's really has changed in those 80 years is that this model grew up in a user pay, user benefit system, right? So you bought a license, the state managed game for the people who bought those licenses, and we still operate under a user pay, but it's an everyone benefits model, right? We do a lot more, but with few exceptions, it's still paid for largely by hunting and fishing license sales that are leveraged against PR and DJ based on the number of hunters and anglers you have.
Yep, and we mentioned the elk project earlier. I mean, Kentucky draws 500 permits a year for hunting. Hundreds of thousands of people go up there and view those elk every year. Yep. Only 500 hunt them, but the 500 and all the rest of us who didn't get drawn are footing the bill for that, and we're fine with that. I mean, I've never met a group of sportsmen or women who felt like they were slighted because they were paying the bills for things that other people got to enjoy. It's just it's just part of the model.
And that's a great point, because we just finished a project with the southeastern states looking at agency perceptions and how the general public and hunters and anglers perceive their state fish and wildlife agency. And it came out, one of the things that came out really strong is that hunters and anglers know they pay for the bulk of conservation and they're okay with it. And they really think that what they do should benefit society. It'd be nice if other people, split it, right? They want an equal funding model, not just a user-based funding model. But that came out loud and clear in your state,
sure,
that they're okay with it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make it sustainable.
And in many cases, they're proud of it.
Right.
So
it doesn't mean it's sustainable given our declines in hunter numbers, but certainly they're okay with the way, how their monies are used to manage wildlife and conservation.
Sure. And I do like that, and we've used it over and over, but user pay public benefit, because if you never pick up a bow or a shotgun or a rifle, or you never get a fishing rod in your hand, or you never go to a range and shoot a box of ammunition, you're still benefiting from clean air, clean water, healthy environment, locally sourced healthy protein, all the stuff that comes along that the hunters and anglers and recreational shooters and boaters are paying for. So, yeah, it's a benefit for everyone.
Right. Yeah, and your state wildlife agency is managing prairies.
Right.
They're managing woodlots for a multitude of species.
Systems and landscapes and ecosystems. Right. They're not just managing, a block here. They're looking at the big picture. So
yeah, and having come from Minnesota, aspen management is, yes, it's really good for woodcock and rough grouse, but it's also good for golden wing warblers. So everything that is done on the wildlife side is beneficial, whether it's aquatic or terrestrial, benefits way more species than are hunted. And I think some of that gets lost a little bit, but I think the folks who buy those licenses know that.
Well, what sometimes does get lost, though, you say management a lot, and yes, it is hands-on work to do that, and these state wildlife agencies aren't getting tax dollars. Right. And that's, I don't think that the public always gets that. Yes, the hunters know it, but the general public I talk to people every day, I don't like how you're spending my tax dollars. Well, that's great. We don't get your tax dollars.
Yeah. And a good example, that I moved to Arizona last year, and you have billboards to explicitly say that Arizona Game and Fish Department does not get tax dollars.
Yeah, and they manage. Every state agency manages every species, not just what you hunt and fish. Sure. Every single species. Right.
And you manage some. You have two fairly iconic species that are in play now. One's the Gould's turkey, which is a subspecies. It's highly sought after. That when at the start of my career, there were probably none in Arizona, or very few in Arizona or New Mexico. And now they're huntable populations. They have draw permits for every year. And so that's one it's like the elk going from a non-hunted, almost extirpated population to something that's manageable. And then you got Mexican wolves, which will probably never be hunted, and we can argue that side either way. But it's a cool kind of iconic desert species that's also being managed, with these same funds, and they're both important to more people than just the hunters and anglers and shooters. Yeah, people love to go see those things. I'm one of those. I just like to know they're in the landscape. If I never see a Gould's turkey, I'm lying now. If I want to see one and shoot one, but because I don't have that subspecies yet. But yeah, it's in general, I just like knowing stuff's put together the right way and it's on the landscape, whether I ever get to enjoy it or not. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, think about Archery in the Schools program, just to kind of change it a little bit. When I was working with Ryan Bronson, who now works for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, when he came to Minnesota as our first R3 coordinator, he was all in on Archery in the Schools. And that was never intended as a pathway to creating a bow hunter. It was a pathway to give kids an alternative sport that was, good for them, good, teams, and just like high school trap leagues. And so that's something you're using these PR dollars to get the equipment and instructors and everything else, but it had nothing really to do with bow hunting.
No.
It's just the importance of an activity.
As a matter of fact, the products they use are tax exempt,
right.
So there's no excise tax on them. There's no license required, so there's no real nexus to conservation there, other than the company selling those bows also sell hunting bows and hunting arrows and all that, and it supports their business model, and we have to support theirs just like they support ours.
And to their credit, though, they've evolved into the 3D Archery Target Challenge, and now kids get used to the idea of shooting a species. In Arizona, we give them a fact sheet. We use only targets that are Arizona-based species, and then we show them, these are the animals that you're looking at today. These are their behaviors. This is the habitat, and we try to, connect them to that next step, because that's a big leap, going to a range versus going out in the woods by yourself. You're in a structured environment. You're in an unstructured environment, but it's working out.
So no T-Rex 3D targets for you, huh?
No.
Yeah, and getting them away from the screens, right, to appreciate outdoor nature. So,
well, that's a great program. And actually, the guy who hired me into Kentucky was the one that started archery in the schools. And I can tell you this: that it wasn't for lack of trying for Roy. He tried his best to get hunting as part of that message. And the issue was not an anti-hunting pushback or anything like that. It was simply, you can only fit so much into a curriculum in schools these days, so you can't go in and add a whole new course. You can't go in and take them a significantly different direction. So they plugged it into PE, but I always loved his constant mantra on all this is that, not every kid can dunk a basketball. Not every kid can kick a field goal, but pretty much any kid can learn to draw and shoot a bow and do it well.
Yeah, and Roy was about my height, so I knew exactly where he was coming from.
He was height challenged. So.
No, and you think about getting some of that stuff into urban schools, it'd be a lot tougher if that were the message. And I think, but getting it into those schools raises that awareness and maybe provokes some interest.
Sure. You have to, like Scott said, you have to figure if they're using the equipment. There's several in the hunter adoption model. There's several sequences you have to go through. One's, being comfortable and familiar with equipment. Well, whether it's a target bow or a hunting bow, they're largely the same type of thing. They operate the same way. So it does get them kind of that comfort level. They still got to deal with, getting out in the woods, having a mentor, multiple experiences, and the big one is, taking an animal's life. That's a big barrier for some people. Not a barrier, but it's a thing they have to kind of overcome and get. And we all done it. And it's a very solemn but respectful process. It is part of hunting. If you don't, I like to say he was my namesake. He's not, but Jose Ortega y Gasset, which said I don't hunt in order to kill. I kill in order to have hunted. So in other words, if you're out bird watching, you're not hunting because there's no opportunity for a harvest there.
But I think it's good that that's a hesitation. I think it's good that every new hunter that we create on the landscape, regardless of what program did it, whether it's hunter ed, whether it's a mentor program, whether they find their way through the pathway of NASP, I like the fact that kids take that seriously. I like the fact that causes a moment of hesitation. I think we're raising the right kind of hunters, and we talk a lot in Arizona about being a safe, legal, ethical user of the resource, right? We want that positive role model and passing that on. We talk a lot about the hunting heritage, right?
Yeah, and I didn't start hunting until I got into college. I came from a non-hunting, really non-fishing family. I fished a little bit as a kid, but we didn't hunt, and I got into it, because I was interested in natural resources and fell into a group of folks that hunted, and so I started hunting. So, and then soon,
then it becomes a lifestyle.
Becomes a lifestyle, right? And then all of a sudden you're running a deer program, going, how did this happen?
I shot a buck in Kentucky 2 years ago, and I told one of our colleagues from Wyoming, I said, this is the first buck I've killed in 10 years. It's just not that I didn't have opportunity, not that I have. It's just. It's not that important to me anymore. The experience of being out there is much more important. It's important for me to take new people. I got my wife started hunting. She took her first deer, and it's like that's more important to me now. I mean, you go through this progression of maturity, I guess, as a hunter. From got to get something. My first something, then I got to work towards getting the bag limit. I want to tag out or get my bag limit, and then I want to get a quality or a trophy animal, and then at some point it's all about the experience. It's like. If I take one every 4 or 5 years, I'm fine.
Yeah, and I think like I drew New Mexico bull tag last year after exactly 1 year of putting in, and it wasn't because I wanted to kill a big New Mexico bull. It was because a very good friend of mine who's 80 asked me to do it, and so we put in and we drew, and then my wife came with us, and she's not a hunter, hasn't expressed any interest in hunting. After a week on horseback hunting elk and doing all the stuff related to getting an elk taken apart and off the mountain, she's now taking hunter ed in Arizona, and we put in, Scott and I and her put in for deer this year. So we created a hunter because she's competitive, but
we'll take them how we can get them.
Take them how we can get them, yes. So we sat here and we put in. So,
but that's really oftentimes all it takes is a little bit of exposure and time. We hear a lot. It takes a hunter to make a hunter. you don't pick this up on YouTube. I mean, you can get a lot of helpful hints and stuff on YouTube, but I started even later than you. I was 40, and I always wanted to. I grew up dying to hunt. My dad hunted when I was a kid. He got sick. I never got to go. I had this thing about the outdoors. I was in the military. I liked being out in the woods and stuff. There's a lot to it, right? And I had the same hesitation. If I was going to do it, God, I don't want to screw this up, right? And she got to watch you do it right. I know your wife, and you know, you obviously were a positive role model, and there's a lot, and you talk about what I don't often care whether I'm successful now that I've got a couple under my belt, but it's that journey, it's that social network. I know we're probably, hopefully we're going to go hunt together next year, but that campfire experience, right? I mean, that's, you know, sometimes your worst hunting trip is your best story, right?
Well, and the other thing that I think often goes unsaid is the amount of character that hunting, because it is a huge responsibility. You know, you're carrying a deadly weapon, you're taking an animal's life potentially. You know, there's a lot of responsibility, and especially when you're dealing with kids. And I'm not like y'all. I'm an early onset hunter. I started hunting I was probably squirrel hunting with my dad at 5 or 6. I was, and people will cringe when they hear this, and it probably technically wasn't supposed to be this way, but I was sitting in a deer stand with a Marlin 30-30 at 8 years old by myself. Okay, and is there any 8-year-old out there you'd like to see that happen with? Right? But I was one of those guys. I was big for my age. My granddad was my first hunting mentor and partner. And to be honest, we were both too big. We hunted built stands in Georgia then. It's like we were too big to fit in the same stand. So we built him one over the hill. He sat over there. We could holler at each other. You know, we didn't have cell phones or any of that. But I'm in a deer stand at 8 years old with a high-powered rifle shooting deer. And you know, I know it's not the norm, but it's like, you know, it takes a certain level of maturity, even in a child, to be able to handle that. But I think it builds a lot of character too. So
yeah, I think so, and then I think, like with Helen, seeing that everything from start to finish, right? We packed in on horseback and mules 5 miles. We were in a base camp. You know, I harvested the elk. Probably 4 miles from camp, and it was hot. You know, October was really hot last year, and so how do you get it out? And caring for that meat and being real mindful of, like, there's a lot of neck meat on an elk, right? And it takes a long time to get it off, but it's you took the animal, you take everything you can, and then when you get back to camp, get it hung up for bears and get cool down, and so there's this big long process. It's more than just that 22 minutes of deer hunting on a video. There's a lot that goes into it, and I think you can appreciate that whole thing.
Going back to the kids, I'm actually amazed at their maturity. We've done focus group studies with parents and kids at our recruitment events, and we do mentored outdoor recruitment events in Arizona, a lot of them, and with a lot of participants. But we really got smart after we did this study. We heard a lot of crap that we didn't think we would hear. The kids have very different views than their parents, and that's cool. We understand that. The kids aren't as concerned with harvesting as their parents. But here's something that really the kids wanted their own campfire. They've watched us tell our stories. They don't want to sit beside us at our campfire. They want to tell their own stories. So they tap in and they know which friends they can tell these stories to and which friends they can't, because they know that hunting isn't popular with everybody. And I did not have that wherewithal at 7 or 8, 10 years old. I just didn't. And it's so, some people are doing some really good jobs raising their children, and the industry's doing such a better job at messaging the values of hunting, the health benefits of hunting, the positive side of hunting. So it's really, I'm impressed as heck with this generation of new hunter ed graduates and new kids taking the field.
Yep. And and Lou, getting back to your wife and going to and having that experience, it's just occurred to me, is like maybe we need to dig a little further into the R3 approach, because I've done the same things. Hey, you've never gone, would you like to go hunting? And sometimes you get a taker, sometimes it's not my thing. That's a different question than would you like to go hunting with me? And there's a lot more people that say, I don't want to go and do it, but I'll go with you and watch you do it. And a lot of those people, once they see you do it and they kind of get comfortable, it's like, hey, this is kind of fun, then they want to take the next step. But if you stopped at, do you want to go hunting? And they're like, I'm not a hunter.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So,
or do you, or again, take it one step further. Do you want to go with me on this hunting trip?
Right.
And the trigger pull is just a small part of the trip.
Yeah, it's the afterthought. Right.
And I've been to Africa not hunting. You've been to Africa hunting, and thinking about that experience and how it would differ from the U.S. experience, and just that, that whole, how much game you see, how you access that game is so much different than it is over here.
And also different from over here is it feeds their population in a lot of cases. We don't feed our population in the U.S. with wild game. There's not enough wild game to do that with. Now, the people who partake in it certainly eat it, but, we just don't have the ability to, if everyone became a hunter tomorrow, there would be no wildlife left, or there'd be no opportunity to go. Exactly.
Right.
So
it'd be hard to get a
but in South Africa, that they depend on that to go into the food chain for so they get healthy protein.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been to Africa yet, but we're planning a
planning
trip.
a trip.
Actually, the three of us had a dinner planning a trip very recently.
And I asked Helen if she wanted to go, and I can't repeat the first word, but the second was yes.
Well, Lou, this has been fascinating.
Yeah.
You've been a great guest. You're a great friend, a longtime friend of both mine and Scott's, and we're glad we could get you on. It's been like sitting around hunting camp for the last half hour.
My pleasure. You think you get to memorialize some of the stuff we did when we were younger that really has this large conservation impact, and who cares that you and I and other folks had a big hand in doing it. The fact is that when we're dead for 200 years, there's going to be elk in the east, across most of the east. And I think that's the story, right?
And if you're driven by ego, you always know that I was a part of that.
I
don't need everybody else to know that. I know I was a part of it. You know,
I
you were a
still
part
have
of
my
it.
Smithsonian magazine that I'm in.
Exactly. So, well, thanks for being on.
You bet, my friend.
Connecting with Conservation. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.